Kia ora, you're listening to Crossing Currents, Aotearoa New Zealand Artists in Venice, a podcast series by Contemporary Hum produced with the support of Creative New Zealand. In this series, we'll be interviewing the Aotearoa artists presenting at the 60th Venice Biennale and its parallel events. I'm Elena Kafka, Managing Director of Contemporary Hum, and today I speak with artist Areez Katki about the Rhapsode's tools will build the Rhapsode's house. This presentation is featured in the 2024 edition of Personal Structures, a biennial contemporary art exhibition organised by the European Cultural Centre, or ECC, that runs parallel to the Venice Biennale. Hosted in two beautiful Venetian buildings, Personal Structures is an opportunity for 200 artists from 51 countries to exhibit their work in Venice and forge new professional connections, something that has attracted several artists from Aotearoa in previous years. However, as an exhibition opportunity, Personal Structures is very different to official Biennale events or other curated exhibitions. It is not strictly a curated event, rather, invited artists have to pay to support their own participation. This results in a range in the quality of the works on display and what are often quite incongruous selections of work. 3 Aotearoa artists are presenting work in this year's edition, and I was very happy to speak with Areez Katki at Personal Structures. Areez Katki has a practice that dwells between the textual and material-based intersections where the phenomenology of a post-colonial identity is examined through modalities of delanguaging and reframing cultural affects. He uses traditional processes of mark-making, including embroidery, weaving, printmaking, and staining, to destabilize the expressionistic hierarchies established by a dominant culture. He splits his time between Mumbai, where he was born, and Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, where he migrated with his family at a young age. Areez's work has been exhibited across Oceania, Asia, North America, and Europe, and he was recently appointed as the Aotearoa New Zealand Visual Artist in Residence at Künstlerhaus Betania in Berlin for 2024 to 2025. We spoke at Palazzo Mora during the opening week of the Venice Biennale in April 2024 in the middle of a thunderstorm. So we are standing in Personal Structures, in your presentation in Personal Structures. Congratulations on your participation.
Thank you.
I wonder if we could begin by you describing the work and what's around us.
Yeah, I think that when we started these conversations about me working on a project to present over here, I didn't like the idea of thinking of it as just a kind of static exhibition where I present work in a kind of white cubey context. That just doesn't appeal to me, especially right now. Or really ever. But what I did want to insist on is being able to produce work that was like not necessarily site-specific, but site-sensitive, which is somewhere close to site-specific, but not site-specific in the sense where it's tailor-made, but rather it's sensitive to the atmosphere, the proximity, the architecture. And I have been to the previous 2 editions of La Biennale, and I did visit Palazzo Mora and Personal Structures both times. And this space that we're standing in, the attic, on the 3rd level, we're technically in Sala 3F, I believe, is a really intriguing T-plan section with, if you can imagine, a sort of narrow passageway that leads to a window, and the window overlooks a very, very interesting set of architectural features. The roof of a church in Canereggio, and it's a parochial site, and it has clear kind of associations with, obviously, like the kind of spaces that house religious knowledge. And I'm kind of obviously interested in responding to that in the work itself. That's kind of how it came about. I chose the space, and then the work started taking more sort of concrete shape and form.
So shall we maybe then begin with the pedagogical drawings?
Sure. And could you describe those and then talk about the process in making those works? Or this work, this series, rather.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of pedagogy, I guess the most straightforward way to describe these works could be to say that they are a series of sculptures suspended in a site-specific, or rather a site-sensitive context, as I said. And like one of the reasons I had sort of painstakingly insisted on presenting this work here is because of that kind of proximity to the church. And I just remember the name. It's called Chiesa Parroquial di Santa Felice. And yeah, it felt imperative to speak through that relationality and juxtaposition in the ways in which religious structures dominate pedagogical inquiries, how architecture has the ability to hold the potential to make and unmake critical conjunctures that we find our bodies contained by and containing. And I saw it once the space was reserved for my work, ways to have those conversations with religious and particularly patriarchal pedagogies by turning them inside out, looking at their harsh lines and their didactic elements, moralistic scriptures. And so these 17 suspended sculptures made of textiles in the space that lead to that T-section window that I mentioned are made of found textiles, and they were found over years of urban encounter, primarily in Mumbai, Bombay, near Zoroastrian fire temples and around the borough of Tardeo, which is where 4 generations of my family lived, until obviously my mother's generation migrated away from India. And yeah, they're each executed in this way where I sort of excavated, you could say, cleaned, restored, and then used them for a ground upon which I did those very kind of instinctual embroidered drawings.
And can you talk about the specific religious script that the works are made in reference to?
Yeah, so the Gathas of Zarathustra are like fascinating texts. They, as you might imagine, they've been transmitted and interpreted diversely over millennia since they were first conceived around 1300 BC. And one might attribute some degree of ambiguity to their exact origins, given the fact that they were mostly orally disseminated. And the expanse of time that it took for these Gathas to eventually make it from ancient Avestan, and eventually being scribed over a millennia later in Middle Avestan script. I mean, what happens when time and tongues and geography, not to mention politics, shift over the centuries? A lot. And so what we read today is a selection of hymns from an ancient rhapsode. That is the role I ascribe to Zarathustra. He's a peripatetic poet whose image and words were then used as foundational material for the world's first monotheistic faith, Zoroastrianism, which I was raised to follow. Now, these hymns, as with any religious text, have been used to perform didactic, moralistic purposes, as guides for the ways in which one is meant to practice their faith. And I find this notion both fascinating and almost kind of hilarious as a sort of student of literature and poetry, but then also to see how, when it's transmitted into the civic and ethno-religious laws, how it has the power to shape and influence pedagogies. And I suppose what my work attempts here is to disrupt that and to trouble that trajectory. I guess it's an attempt to suspend Zarathustra's words back to the place where poetry, in my opinion, comes from, which is linguistic play.
Amazing.
One thing I should mention is that the 17 hymns, they were written in 17 sections that are called has, and ha is short for Haiti, which is the Avestan word for fragment or cut. And I suppose I just wanted to mention and shed light on the fragmentary aesthetic because It works on various levels here, and it always has for me. On one hand, we have these fragments, literally, because they were found texts, and what I'm doing is I'm performing a certain symmetry where I'm using found textiles upon which to describe what I look at as non-linguistic communication through a kind of relationship I built with material that is found, in this case, cloth. But then in the case of the works that are on on my left, your right, not cloth, they are made of earth.
Yes. This series is Disjecta Membra Series T.
Mm-hmm.
So could I ask you to describe these works and what they're made of?
Sure. I suppose I see them as documents. I think that the way in which I wanted them to be sort of read is as texture and material that is in its sort of most untampered with form, that it's no accident that the tiles that I've produced here, 9 of them, are facing almost directly the window across which you have a pedagogical, parochial structure, and it also is covered in terracotta, albeit curved terracotta shingles. And I think that quite often as artists of a certain generation, or perhaps owing to more personal processes of thinking, we impose limitations and stick to strict rules or methodologies of formulating and producing work. And I think over the course of grieving my grandmother's death, all through till the time I was starting my artist residency at Tylee Cottage in Whanganui, I realized how something freeing, something devoid of my own hands and its control needed to be released. And it was a sort of emotional release, but also a way of, I suppose, relinquishing a sense of agency and power and allowing natural circumstances to form the patterns upon which I thought this material sort of deserved to be treated with. And the material itself, sorry, I didn't mention, is kaolinite clay that was found in my parents' backyard, our family home in Tamaki Makaurau in East Auckland, where my grandmother used to wake up every morning and feed the birds, which is a ritual of hers since she was a girl in India, and that she continued even after she migrated to Aotearoa. In many instances, I've thought of the ways in which my grandmother raised me with various modes of care and pedagogical treatments, I suppose. These learnings were quite broad. You know, they went from something that's instinctual and affectual to simple things like how to cook certain Persian stews that you will never be able to find a recipe for written down, to embroidery or anything that has to do with, I guess, like care and restoration, and it's a sort of domestic, but also rooted in care. And so this ritual of hers to feed birds felt like something particularly meaningful for me. I suppose the morning after she passed away, I flew back to Tamaki Makaurau, and the house was empty, and I immediately just felt like breaking up pieces of bread and gathering some seeds and feeding the birds the way she did. And that's when I actually discovered that, I always knew that Tamaki Makaurau had a lot of clay, particularly kaolinite clay, but I saw this really... I suppose my mother had been doing some gardening, and I saw this divot in the grass that had this thick vein of yellow clay running through it. And a few minutes later, I just grabbed a little spade and I started examining it, and then the next day I started digging for more clay, and I used that clay essentially. I took it with me to Whanganui, and I blended it with some raku for a little bit of stability, and sand from the Caspian Sea. And yeah, so the material itself has a loaded geographical blend. And I suppose it speaks of migration, it speaks of hybrid identities, but it is essentially a document to me.
Yeah, totally. I mean, one thing that really strikes me about the series in the context of your broader practice is the markings are also a kind of sign or a sort of linguistic inscription. Yeah, could you talk more about the markings and how they came about?
Right, yeah, sure. I mean, it was very simple, really. I kind of wanted to look at the most straightforward way to present the material, to produce something that was, as I said earlier, untampered by my hands. But as we know, these things are hard to realize, and it just involved a level of knowledge about clay and its stable or unstable properties when milled and blended after being sourced. And there were kind individuals in Whanganui who helped me with that because my knowledge of clay was relatively limited. Though I did do some research around the properties of kaolinite clay and the firing temperatures. But my neighbor across from Tylee Cottage, Fiona, and also really wonderful Whanganui potter Lee Anderton Hall, both of them helped me. And the rest was about time and chance and seeing how slabs of wet clay could collect marks from seeds and the flocks of birds who I fed over the course of a couple of mornings, much as Granny used to do all her life.
You've spoken about the work as a notional archaeological practice. How do ideas of excavation, restoration, or preservation feature here, and what kind of knowledges do you think are being produced through this kind of archaeology?
In the more recent years, I seem to have grown very wary and suspicious of the motivations and effects of practices from Western pedagogies, particularly the ways in which archaeological practices have not always, but often enough, been conducted as a flattening tool that both homogenizes and consumes material, particularly material from ancient material cultures, particularly those deemed by academic practices historically as Oriental or adjacent to Orientalist psychologies. This consumption of the other, which is a quote from Bell Hooks, is a form of domination that I'm growing more sensitive to in my discipline, and you know, this goes across both my practice as an artist as well as a writer. And it brings to the fore a queer relationality with material culture, which I suppose might be framed as a notional or counter-archaeology, one that reframes, or at least tries to reframe the discipline as a restorative one, a caring one, one that doesn't have acquisitive or colonial ties anymore, and it's something I'm still kind of figuring out. On another hand, I think that what I'm trying to navigate, however obliquely, is a way to place the notion of excavation in the realm of play, almost this kind of innocent, childlike state, or by like relational proximity to the material world. I suppose the ways in which this might provide new avenues of understanding histories and cultures, all the things that archaeology tries to decode, is by contextualizing material excavation through an affective framework, where the emotional and the personal sit at the fore. In a way, it feels like psychoanalytical thinking, which, I don't know, from the perspectives of theorists like Jacqueline Rose, I am very interested in learning more about.
You mentioned bell hooks. Obviously, the title of your presentation is a reference to Audre Lorde. The Rhapsode's tools will build the Rhapsode's house.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about the title and how you see it fitting in with the two series on view here?
Yeah, the title it goes back to a work that was actually first presented in an exhibition, There Is No Other Home But This, with Khadim Ali, which was curated by Zara Stanhope at the Govett Brewster in 2022 in Namotu. It was a singular panel that had the title "The Rhapsode's Tools Will Build the Rhapsode's House." And at the time I was doing a considerable amount of thinking my way through and hopefully out of the ways in which certain heteronormative, colonial, capitalistic hegemonies had shaped the ways in which thoughts formed, were perceived, and communicated. And it has been at the systemic, linguistic, social, sexual roots that so many of these encumbrances lie when it comes to finding modes of learning and communicating that don't adhere to white linguistic or patriarchal linguistic. So here I guess I'm citing Audre Lorde's wisdom in her 1979 speech, "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House." And I started to think about the roles we play historically in shaping the structures that encase our bodies. What are the languages used and by whom to inform the building of these structures? Who, if I may posit an alternative indigenous reading of Lorde's statement, might be a figure that I trust or that I can trust more than the educators who I, in my experience, in my socialization, have mostly been men of Eurocentric origins. And so how might I look at language again and disseminate it within the way I communicate? And how could a rhapsode, which is a peripatetic poet and educator, possibly be a figure through whom my ideas could be suspended in all of their amorphous and queer and cross-temporal splendor? And so I suppose, to put it simply, the title, "The Rhapsode's Tools Will Build the Rhapsode's House," does both. It acknowledges the problems faced by mastery, which thinkers who I adore, like Julieta Singh, encourage us to unlearn. And the title then also suggests the possibility of a gentle, affectual way of framing our personal structures through learning and questioning authoritarian voices, and most importantly, through the notions of care and play being central to ideas of a fuller, richer experience through which I would like to imagine pedagogy being framed.
Could you talk about how you understand pedagogy and how it features in each of the series?
I mean, I don't know if I necessarily would claim to understand pedagogy, but at this point in my practice and in my life, it has been definitely worth reflecting upon how certain relationships and processes of learning and unlearning have come to shape the way I synthesize and formulate my theses, whether they're the art installations or in my writings. So this is, again, where being a migrant and being queer in the positions of precarity all through one's life means new things, right? So at least they can, and I can absorb and process linguistic information differently because of how multilingual we had to be practically raised from birth, speaking 3 languages from sort of infancy. And so pedagogy becomes a different thing for me. It involved, and it still involves, the notion of play and of guessing and of both decoding and encoding oneself in the context of a global cultural system that constantly asks a body like a migrant's to justify itself. It asks, where do you belong? And the answer through pedagogies rooted in care, I suppose, is one that my practice tries to engage with, whether through the joy of encountering materials or responding to them instinctively, or through conversations with beloved whānau, with mentors, with matriarchs, and the systems of care provided by their teachings.
Could you talk about how you came to present in personal structures and what that process was like for you?
I was invited to first develop and then present a new body of work in personal structures for its 7th edition in Venice. And it began with a letter of engagement from the director of art, Sara Danieli, from the ECC, very early in 2023, while I was just about to start my Tylee Cottage Residency in Whanganui. The process involved a few very long conversations with Sara while I was trying to formulate work for other projects at the time. And I began to understand more the context of personal structures, and in spite of having visited their two previous editions, there was still a lot more to learn about it, its history, and also, I don't know, some of the issues that we might have with it is the European cultural center. So yeah, there is a certain level of unease there for me. Though it was less than ideal, or both logistically and financially, I felt compelled to try at least and run with freedom, though it can be risky, that lack of curatorial expertise provides, which is something that I am wary and critical of with the kind of ways in which this particular exhibition is structured. There are threads of inquiry I've long wished to explore in an independent conversation with cultural material and also with my ancestors and antecedents. So I thought that it could be potentially a good opportunity to spend a year or so doing just that, and to find my work situated in Venice, to try and do it as sensitively as I could within this kind of busy global context that the Biennale is situated in.
You have an interest in Indigenous art studies, which continues to be a central theme of the Venice Biennale and its parallel events. So in the previous edition, Yuki Kihara, who was representing Aotearoa New Zealand that year, was involved in coordinating the first Solidarity Network, which was between artists representing Albania, Britain, Poland, Singapore, and Nepal. And that year, the GAX Forum, GAX Forum, also hosted discussions with trans-Indigenous art practices, with speakers who had worked on the Sami Pavilion, and another collateral event at the Biennale that had an Indigenous focus. So I was really interested in asking you where you'll be looking this time.
I'm afraid my answer would be quite short, because I have been so caught up in the work at hand to present my work, which is terrible, really. I feel a little bit almost ashamed for not having kept track of who's showing and what I want to sort of see while I'm here in Venice. But that's why I gave myself a whole week, so that I can come here, kind of come in cold. Obviously attend the openings that I'm obliged to attend to, the previews and the events, but then I've put aside a decent chunk of time to explore. What I will say is the GAX Forum in the last edition was remarkable. The Sami Pavilion was an incredible sight. One thing that I loved about their presentation is how, when asked whether they could have the Scandinavian countries' names redacted from the plaque in the pavilion, and they were basically sort of rebuked, and they said, no, sorry, we won't be removing Norway, Sweden, and so on from the architecture. One of the Sami artists put up a piece of bark cloth covering from a distance and obfuscating the names from being visible. And I thought that was a really powerful gesture. And so that's the kind of thing that I'm interested in seeing how resistance plays out, particularly given the very precarious context we are in today, politically. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, without a doubt, this edition will be a very, very interesting for that reason.
Yes.
Yes, indeed.
It's almost like every time I've come to La Biennale, there has been some weird sense of, it's not necessarily the most politically charged art event, but it somehow ends up being an event that portends something. It's like a prescient look into, a glimpse into what our future beholds. And I don't know if it's looking very bright right now, but like, for example, May You Live in Interesting Times was the year before the pandemic. Come on.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yes. The thunder was really,
Yeah,
it's really well timed.
Yeah, it's a stormy day in Venice, by the way.
Yeah.
Spring storms.
Spring storms, that's right. What's it like being in Venice during this busy week of the Biennale opening, and what does it mean for you to be presenting in Venice during the run of the Biennale?
I mean, it's a really interesting time to be presenting work here. I honestly haven't thought too much about it because over the past year, I've had this wonderful, productive time when I lived basically for all of 2023 in Whanganui, and I am just so grateful to the communities there, the city itself, the town itself, the awa, and the ways in which it offered more grace and time with which I could produce work. And so, yeah, there's something about being within proximity of water, much as we are in Venice, that kind of resonates, and it leads me to think about that wonderful fecund year that I got to, had the privilege of being able to spend in Whanganui. It started with the Tylee Cottage Residency, but much like many Tylee Cottage residents, I too stayed back I stayed double the amount of time because it was such a great place to be working. And sorry, back to your question. I think it's wonderful, to go from this small town in the North Island of Aotearoa and to have been sort of quietly chipping away at work. In fact, the tiles from Disjecta Membra were packed in pizza boxes that were given to me by a friend who owns a pizzeria in Whanganui. So there's this like element of the work being produced in this small space, this sleepy town, and then bringing it to basically the center of the global art world here. So as contexts change, as our bodies move between these spaces, there's a lot to process, and I don't think I've processed it all just yet. Yeah, it's still early.
Great. Yep. That's amazing, the pizza boxes.
Yeah. I sent pizza boxes to Italy. When they arrived, I sent like the guys in Whanganui a photo. Their pizza boxes arrived safely.
In Italy, yeah. Yeah, it's so good.
You've been listening to Crossing Currents, Aotearoa New Zealand Artists in Venice, an original podcast series by Contemporary Hum. Listen to Crossing Currents wherever you get your podcasts, or visit contemporaryhum.com for each episode, along with a transcript and images. Our thanks to Creative New Zealand for their support, Hamish Peterson for editing and mixing, Matariki Williams for cultural advisory, and Emma Kanyuk for design. Kia ora.